Alrighty, so let's get started. Okay. Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. We're thrilled to have you here. My name is Jessica Chu. I am a member of the ICC communications team, and I will be helping my coworkers for today's session. Just a couple of housekeeping items to begin with. This webinar is now being recorded, and we will publish the recorded video online afterward. Everyone's microphone is currently on mute. If not, please mute your microphone when you're not speaking so we can minimize background noise. Next, while our panelists are speaking, if you run into any technical issues or have questions about the presentation, please write them in the chat box and the question block on the right side of your screen. And we will be collecting throughout the webinar and answer them during the Q&A session. So let me give you some background about today's event, lifetime emission from aircraft under a net zero budget. It is very exciting because we have more than 200 people registered, which is really impressive for us. We hope that this will be a productive and informative session for you. This webinar should last about 45 minutes to an hour long with a presentation for the first half. We will dive into our latest research evaluating a lifetime emission of the in-service fleet and future aircraft deliveries, followed by a Q&A session for the second half. Overall, this webinar will offer a new insights into the role of manufacturers in progressing towards aviation's net zero target. Next, allow me to introduce our speakers today. First, I want to introduce my coworker, Dan Rutherford. Dan is our Senior Director of Research and the Director of the Aviation Program, and he will be taking the lead on this webinar and moderating the Q&A session. My other coworker is Praja Kumar, who is a researcher on ICCT's aviation team, will be delivering a presentation. And Supraja's day-to-day research focuses on hydrogen infrastructure, engine emission standards, and net zero aviation targets. Later in the presentation, Supraja will provide an in-depth overview of our methodology and emission scenarios and discuss necessary steps for aligning the aviation sector with net zero pathway, and lastly, highlight key findings and implications for aircraft and engine manufacturer. Okay, I think I covered the agenda and the basics, and we are finally ready to dive into the actual presentation. So, Supraja, fire away. The floor is all yours now.
Thanks for the introduction, Jessica, and thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today. I'm excited to share more about this recent paper that Dan and I worked on titled Lifetime Emissions from Aircraft Under a Net Zero Budget. And this is just an outline of how this will go. So I'll start with some background on why we decided to write this paper. And then we'll move into primary research questions, methodology, results, and conclusions. And then we'll have time at the end to take questions, which, as Jessica mentioned, you can submit at any point in time during the webinar through the questions tab. So first, some background on our motivations behind writing this paper. In 2022, the aviation sector, including industry groups like IKEA, IBAC, and IATA, committed to a 2050 net zero CO2 target. The industry has been largely bullish on emissions reductions coming from sustainable aviation fuels, but we know from net zero roadmaps that aircraft level improvements, like new aircraft types with fuel efficiency improvements and new designs that are powered by hydrogen and electricity, will be needed to reach this target. But that being said, we haven't seen any concrete commitments on when these will be introduced into the market. On the other hand, we've seen manufacturer market forecasts from Boeing, Embraer, Airbus, projecting a doubling in the fleet size over the next 20 years with over 40,000 aircraft deliveries expected. So here on the right, we see a screenshot out of the most recent Boeing commercial market outlook. And they're projecting almost 44,000 deliveries over the next 20 years. The lifetime of an aircraft on average is about 20 to 30 years. It's important that we consider the lifetime emissions of both the existing fleet, so all the aircraft in service today, and these projected deliveries when we think about the compatibility of deliveries and net zero roadmaps. And when we say lifetime emissions in this paper, we refer to the CO2 that's emitted from the usage of an aircraft from when it's delivered, so when it enters service, all the way to its retirement. So its entire usage lifetime. So what has the OEM progress been like to date? We've seen OEMs starting to publish their annual Scope 3 emissions and sustainability reports, and this is a really good step forward in terms of transparency. Scope 3 emissions can be thought of as lifetime emissions, and within these reports, OEMs have been publishing the Scope 3 emissions of aircraft delivered over a given year. And these usage emissions are, you can think of these usage emissions as Scope 1 emissions for airlines. And in terms of commitments, we've seen Boeing, Airbus, and Embraer all having committed to the 2050 net zero target, and they have all set a 2030 target to ensure that all of their aircraft can operate on 100% sustainable aviation fuels. Currently, aircraft are only certified to operate on SAF blends of up to 50%. So they hope to get to 100% by 2030. And of the major aircraft OEMs, we've seen Airbus set a target to reduce Scope 3 emissions by 46% by 2035. Looking at all of these commitments and targets coming from different players in the sector, we recognize that there's a role for both the airlines and OEMs in a net zero transition. The aircraft technologies that OEMs are producing can directly enable airlines to maximize their CO2 reductions. So to explore this relationship further, we wanted to identify the year by which all new aircraft need to be zero emission in order to meet the 2050 target. And when I say zero emission, both in this presentation and in our paper, we mean operating either on 100% SAF or powered by hydrogen or electricity. And to answer that question, we developed a model to estimate the lifetime emissions of the current fleet, so all the aircraft in service today, and deliveries over the next 20 years. And then we compared our model's results to OEM estimates in order to assess the accuracy of reported Scope 3 emissions and sustainability reports. So as I mentioned, a lot of different groups have committed to the net zero target and also created net zero roadmaps that allocate various carbon budgets to the sector through 2050 and also have different decarbonization levers to get there. And in this paper, we took an average of 4 net zero roadmaps, 2 for Mission Possible Partnership, ATAG's Waypoint 2050, and the ICCT's Vision 2050 report. And we calculated an aggregated carbon budget of 18.4 gigatons of CO2 on a tank-to-weight basis. And we did this on a tank-to-weight basis just because it would be consistent across these roadmaps. We then proceeded to define 3 possible scenarios, each with differing levels of ambitions, focusing on 2 mitigation measures: sustainable aviation fuels and fuel efficiencies. So first, here on the left, we have our baseline scenario, which is a business as usual scenario, assuming no SAF uptake and no new aircrafts through 2042. And then we have an optimistic scenario, which assumes refuel EU level volumes applied globally, but still no new aircraft types through 2042. And then we have our most ambitious scenario all the way on the right, which assumes both refuel EU level SAF volumes globally and aggressive fuel burn improvements that are coming from new aircraft types being phased into the fleet starting in 2034. And we assume that they come in at about 17% of the fleet in 2034 and go all the way up to 100% of deliveries by 2039. Um, and then we define the existing fleet composition. To do this, we use the IBA's fleet module, and we broke out the existing fleet by aircraft class. So we have regional jets, narrow bodies, wide bodies, and freighters. And then we identified representative aircraft types in each class. So for the regional jets, we have Embraer 175s, Boeing 737s, and Airbus A320s for narrow bodies, et cetera. And we also got the average age of each of these aircraft classes within the existing fleet. And you'll see that it varies from about 11 years old to 20 years old, with freighter aircraft being the oldest just because they typically stay in service for the longest. And we take a similar approach to future deliveries through 2042 as well. But we update the representative aircraft types to be the most advanced types that are currently in service. And in our fleet turnover modeling, we needed to use aircraft survival and activity curves in order to define both the survival of an aircraft in the fleet and also the annual activity hours of a given aircraft. And these come from a previous ICCT study done in collaboration with Argonne National Laboratory. And then this is the calculation. Here is how we calculated CO2 emissions within our model. So first, we calculated an aircraft's average CO2 emissions per hour, which we defined to be the product of mission speed, which is average speed not including taxi time, fuel burn, fuel-specific energy, which was held constant at 42.8 megajoules per kilogram, and tank-to-wake fuel carbon intensity. So for Jet A, this was assumed to be 73.16 grams CO2e per megajoule. And for scenarios that included SAF deployment, we took these out of the ICCT's PACE model. And then using this average CO2 per hour value that we just calculated, we multiplied it with the activity and survival curves of the aircraft in the fleet, which come from those survival curves and activity curves that we just saw, and sum them up across the deliveries by aircraft's representative types. And this gives us the total lifetime emissions of both the existing fleet and future deliveries. And future deliveries are made up of both aircraft that are replacing retiring aircraft and aircraft that are servicing fleet growth. And the fleet growth rate that we used in this study was 3.2%, which comes out of the Boeing commercial market. So we first compared the results of our modeling to OEM sustainability reports, and we used the 2022 ones because those were the most recent at the time of writing this paper. And on the left, we have the manufacturer estimates of their Scope 3 emissions. And then here we have our ICCT model estimates. So you can see that our model is almost identical to Airbus's estimate, but about 25% off from Boeing's estimate and over 200% off from Embraer's Scope 3 estimate. And these discrepancies can be attributed to really different methods of calculation and the variables that we've used. So the survival and activity curves, the speeds and fuel burn. And I think this variation also highlights the need for more transparency and consistency across calculation methodologies for Scope 3 emissions, because we used the same model and compared it to these three OEMs and got pretty drastically different results. So when you run the fleet turnover model through these scenarios that I just defined, the baseline, optimistic SAF, and optimistic SAF plus fuel efficiency, the results look like this. And I want to clarify that these are the lifetime emissions of a given year's delivery. So for example, if we look at 2024, this value is the emissions over the entire lifetime of all the aircraft delivered in that year in the baseline scenario. And then this is the value for the optimistic SAF and the optimistic SAF plus fuel efficiency scenario. And we projected these out for deliveries through 2042. You can see that in the baseline scenario, there is this consistent emissions growth for each year's delivery till about 2040, where it starts to level out. In the optimistic SAF scenario, which is this one, the uptake of SAF does drastically reduce the emissions, and you'll see that the decline begins kind of in the late 2030s, where SAF ones are at higher volumes. So we're at over 30% at this point. And then even better, we have our most optimistic scenario here with fuel efficiency improvements. And this brings the lifetime emissions of deliveries down to a fraction of what we're seeing in the baseline. So here we show when we run out of that net zero carbon budget that I described in the baseline scenario and the most ambitious scenario. We also show when we would deplete a 1.5C and 2C carbon budget. We derive these from IPCC reports, maintaining aviation's share of the carbon budget at 2.4% on a tank to weight basis. And the purpose of doing this was really to consider a sensitivity analysis using these two temperature change boundaries. So looking at the base scenario, we can see that we deplete the 1.5C budget with the emissions of the existing fleet. The net zero carbon budget with lifetime emissions of deliveries through 2032. And then the 2C budget with the lifetime emissions of deliveries through 2038. And then if we look at our most ambitious scenario, we deplete our 1.5C budget with committed emissions of the existing fleet, the same as the baseline. We deplete our net zero budget with deliveries through 2037. And the 2C budget, it's not shown on here, but you would deplete it around 2053. So we just learned that the committed emissions of the existing fleet make up a huge share of the net zero budget, about half. So we wanted to take a closer look of the breakdown of these emissions. And we did so by looking at them by aircraft class and by manufacturer. So here we have them broken out by aircraft class on the left, and you'll notice that single aisle aircraft really dominate the share of emissions, largely due to their volumes, followed by wide bodies, freighters, and then regional jets. And on the right, we have it broken out by manufacturer. You'll notice that Boeing and Airbus dominate the emissions share because they deliver most of those narrow body and wide body aircraft and make up a large portion of commercial fleets. So we know now that we're running out of the carbon budget somewhere between 2032 and 2037's deliveries, right? The lifetime emissions of those deliveries. So what is the market for new aircraft deliveries that are allowable under the net zero budget? We see that if we have aggressive SAF uptake and fuel efficiency improvements, OEMs would be able to deliver about 4,500 more of conventional aircraft. So those are aircraft that are still using some amount of jet fuel. But if after this net zero budget is depleted, only zero emission aircraft are delivered. So they're either running on 100% SAF, hydrogen, or electricity. We see that there's market for over 10,000 of these new aircraft for OEMs in the optimistic scenario and almost 15,000 in the baseline scenario. And the final question that we wanted to look at was CDR volume. So if you looked at those net zero maps road maps that we saw earlier really closely, a lot of them included removals as part of their mitigation strategies. And we wanted to see how much would be required to remove extra emissions from deliveries after the carbon budget was depleted. We only considered CDR in the form of direct air capture in the scope of this study. And when we calculated these volumes, they ranged from 5 to 22 gigatons, depending on the mitigation measures that are in place. So about 5 gigatons in the optimistic SAF plus fuel efficiency scenario, and about 22 gigatons in that baseline scenario. And this is over 2,500 times the capacity of direct air capture facilities that are currently announced to be in advanced stages right now for use by all sectors. So it's, levels of magnitude above what is currently existing or going to exist over the next decade. And conclusions. So we can see that aligning aviation with Paris's well below 2C aspiration is possible, but will require significant ambition and investment in all mitigation measures, not just SAF. And we know that aircraft will need to start being net zero in 2035 in order to meet their 2050 net zero targets. So this implies that we would need a lot of investments in zero emission planes that are powered by hydrogen and electricity. And I really want to emphasize the importance of developing hydrogen powered narrow body aircrafts, because as we saw, narrow bodies make up a large share of our current fleet's emissions. And it's also crucial that OEMs are able to ensure that all aircraft can burn 100% SAF beginning in 2030, because this will be needed to maximize those reductions. And that's all for me. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you, Supraja. Great presentation and really interesting work here. So I have a few questions that have been submitted through the chat. So we'll go through those, and we definitely have time for a robust discussion section. So if any of our listeners have additional questions, please also put those into the chat. So the first question comes from Chris Lyle. It relates to the assumptions that we use for the carbon intensities of SAFs. So specifically, are we assuming that 100% SAF is by definition net zero or not? So Supraja, can you say a little bit more about the assumptions that you used for the carbon intensity of the SAFs in the modeling?
Yeah, sure. So we broke out the carbon intensity of the SAF by feedstock. And if I recall, I don't have the carbon intensity chart in here, but it's in our paper. And if I recall correctly, it goes down from 73.16, which is our Jet A fuel carbon intensity, to about 30 in the optimistic SAF at 70% SAF usage. So we do have carbon intensities for different feedstocks that are built into our SAF assumptions.
So the quick takeaway is no, we are not assuming that 100% SAF is net zero. So
yes, correct.
Okay, great, thank you. So a second question relates to LTO fuel use and how that's reflected in the calculation. So the question was, is there a specific reason for not including LTO fuel use in the calculation? So Supraja, can you say a little bit more? I know that you calculated a fuel burn per hour average using, I think, ADI as I recall. But can you explain how, like, if LTO fuel use was actually a part of that average fuel burn per hour, or if it was purely focused on cruise fuel?
So the fuel burn actually comes out of, yeah, so yeah, the fuel burn includes LTO. It just doesn't include taxi. So it's the whole, it's an average taken across the entire flight.
Okay, got it. So I think the data set that we have doesn't specifically include taxi time or taxi fuel use. Is that correct?
Yeah, and the reason we did that was because we're using mission speeds instead of the full air speeds.
Okay, thank you. Obviously, there is concern about LTO emissions, and there was another point in the chat about the importance of non-volatile particulate matter. So, since we were comparing our emissions to net zero carbon budgets in this study, by definition, non-volatile particulate matter is not included. But I will put in a plug for a study we have coming out next year, which is to expand our net zero CO2 technology pathway to include short-lived climate pollutants like non-volatile particulate matter and contrails. So super important area with fast-moving science. And so watch the space for more work on that next year from ICCT. Let's see. A question here about, ooh, this is a tricky one. The question is, what land use increase would we expect to result from the SAF usage assumed in the study? I think this is probably, do you want to take a pass at that, or should we say we didn't look at it?
It really wasn't in the scope of the study. Yeah, I will say it would be aggressive because we've applied refuel EU level volumes globally, but it's not something we calculate.
You. And there is a question here about demand reductions. So um, we've seen that many businesses have been able to thrive without travel during the pandemic. So the question is, I think we'll say two parts. Was demand reduction considered in your study? Sort of question one. And then two, uh, how do you how do you see demand reduction fitting within sort of the net zero carbon budget?
So I'll start with the second part of it. And it's something that we did address in our ICCT Vision 2050 report, where demand reduction was a part of mitigation measures. And I think it is important. We didn't consider it in this study because we were focusing on how OEMs could contribute to reduction measures. So in this case, it was just SAF and fuel efficiency improvements that we looked at. But I do agree that demand reduction is important and a big part of this.
Great. So I see a couple of questions related to hydrogen aircraft. So let me ask them each now. So first question, how do you see hydrogen being used in aviation? In fuel cell configurations with electric motors or in direct combustion? Uh, we'll start that.
Okay, yeah. Well, we're seeing both in conceptual designs right now. I think hydrogen fuel cell aircraft or like smaller hydrogen fuel cell retrofits would be earlier to enter the market, serving regional routes or shorter routes. And hydrogen combustion aircraft would enter the market later and be able to replace larger aircraft. But yeah, I think I answered the question.
Okay.
Yeah.
So here's one. It's very tricky, but I know you're doing other work on hydrogen, so you might be able to answer it. What are your expectations for cost per kilogram of hydrogen and also the CO2 equivalent, sort of reductions associated with hydrogen production?
Mm, that's a tricky one. In terms of the CO2 reductions, it's largely dependent on the grid. So we see a lot of variation in grid carbon intensity across regions and countries, which directly the hydrogen is. So we always try to push for green hydrogen production. And what was the other part? Sorry, Dan.
Oh, cost,
Cost.
kilogram per fuel production.
That's also a tricky one. Um, and again, varies across regions. I will say it would, aviation as a sector would likely feed into a larger hydrogen ecosystem. So it would definitely be more expensive than jet fuel. But depending on how much of it and the volumes that are being produced in a certain region, it can be made competitive.
Thank you. Following on that theme, a question here about where current industry efforts stand. So, what is your impression of where the industry stands with respect to the development of both SAFs and zero emission aircraft? So, maybe relate it back to these pathways we have, the baseline case versus the
Hmm.
optimistic SAF and then optimistic SAF plus fuel efficiency. Do you have an intuition for where we are on those relative curves?
Maybe I'll go back to that really quick. So these were our scenarios as a reminder for everybody. Um, Unfortunately, I think we are closer to the baseline than I would like to be right now. We don't have these really aggressive SAF targets in most markets. We have Refuel EU in the EU, and we've had kind of this agreement for the CAF3 goal last year. But other than that, we haven't seen significant uptakes in SAF over the past few years. So I'd say as of now, we're closer to the baseline in the SAF category, and also in the fuel efficiency category, because I don't think we have a clear sense of when these new aircraft types will start coming into the market. Um, and yeah, we would need more clarity on that to get closer to this fuel efficiency as well.
Great, thank you. Great questions here. Let me try and order them in a way that makes sense. Yes, so here's a question about, I think, the extent to we look the extent to which we looked at aircraft purchases across regions or by specific airlines. So the question is, does this study include a breakdown of who are the major players investing in fleet expansion in the committed order book, and also where in the world those planes will be made and flown?
That's a great question, and it's actually something that we've kind of jotted down for future work. Um, if we look at something like the Boeing commercial market outlook, we see that there's so much variation regionally about where these deliveries are going. But this study, we really just took a global uh, outlook on it. But breaking it down by region is definitely something I think we will consider for a future study.
Thank you. Great job keeping up with all of these questions. Let me choose another one here. Actually, maybe I'll pose one of my own to you, Supraja. Um, in slide 12, we saw significant variation in the Scope 3 emissions estimates for the three individual manufacturers. So that's the slide where you were comparing our estimated lifetime emissions to those of Boeing, Airbus, and Embraer. There you go. So I think on net, our estimate is very close to that of Airbus. We're overestimating relative to Boeing, and then our estimates are very, very high compared to Embraer. Do you have any intuition for what explains the variance here, and in particular, why our estimates seem to be much higher than Embraer's?
Yeah, this one bothered me a lot when I was doing the modeling and I was trying to figure out why there was this huge variation here. And I don't have a clear answer as to why, but there are really four variables that we look at when we do this calculation, and it's the survival curve, the activity curve, the fuel burn, and the aircraft speed. And that's kind of how we calculate the scope 3 emissions for a year. So I would imagine that the Embraer methodology has huge variations in one or multiple of these. It could be something specific to how they're modeling out activity and survival for their regional jets that is different from the curves that we've used. But it's unclear because the methodologies aren't published in that level of granularity. And I would put in a plug here to say, I think it would be really helpful if they were, and if they were consistent across OEMs so that we can look at their estimates and say, all of these used similar methodologies to reach these numbers, and we kind of know where they're coming
Thank you. So there's a question here about what is needed to scale CDR nets or carbon capture from the mid 2030s, since that seems to be important to the industry. So do you think we should raise an escalating carbon price on aviation over the next decade in order to have a chance of achieving the scaling of removals? And do you think that such an escalating emissions price would help with our other objectives? So early retirement of old aircraft, acceleration of alternative propulsion, et cetera.
Yeah, so this is kind of something that one of our colleagues, Sola, has explored in her work, applying a frequent flyer levy to tax aviation emissions. And I think that it could be effective, but I'm not sure. I don't know the extent to which that CDR should be relied on, because like I mentioned, the volumes that we are going to need are levels of magnitude above what is available for all sectors. And we know that decarbonizing other sectors will come before aviation. So yes, it would be beneficial to increase investment in building more CDR facilities, but it should definitely not be the only measure that is explored. And I'd say we should prioritize things like zero emission aircraft over CDR.
Great. Here's a question that might make you cringe a little bit, Supraja, because you and I really went back and forth for a long time on this. An anonymous attendee has a very sharp question about tank-to-wake emissions for SAFs. So the question is, wouldn't tank-to-wake emissions of SAFs by definition be considered zero CO2e per megajoule, regardless of the feedstock?
Um,
Ooh, I would take the opposite position here, but why don't you go
Wait, you want
first?
to go first? No, you can go.
Yes, so we had extensive debate about how to do tank to wake emissions of SAFs. There are a variety of ways of doing this. One of them, and which is my least favorite, is to make that assumption, in essence, that for biogenic SAFs in particular, tank to wake emissions are zero because the carbon that is emitted is being captured upstream of the fuel production. So that's one approach. The other approach, which I think is clearer and makes more sense, is tank to wake emissions of SAFs being, in essence, equivalent to fossil jet fuel because it is a hydrocarbon. When you burn it, it does emit CO2 at essentially the same rate as conventional jet fuel. But to credit the biogenic reduction and the carbon capture reduction upstream of the vehicle. So that would be on the well to tank portion. For this particular study, we took a hybrid approach. We actually didn't clearly answer that question. We knew that in taking this frame of estimating scope 3 emissions for manufacturers, we were apportioning the responsibility for emissions differently from every other study that's been done to date. So rather than taking either of those extreme cases where we said tank to wake is zero or tank to wake is 100%, we averaged the SAF reductions and then assigned them both to well to tank and tank to wake. Sorry, I fully answered your question, Supraja. But thank you. That is a very sharp question. Let's see. There's a pretty vigorous back and forth in the chat about the merits of SAFs versus zero emission planes. That is maybe beyond our scope here. Here's one. The project, how important would you think airlines fleet renewal is with next generation aircraft to the achievement of the net zero target?
Oh, I think it's extremely important. So let me go back to our projections chart. So in this, uh, what is it, line plot, we introduce fuel efficiency improvements in 2034, and those new, more fuel efficient aircraft make up 100% of deliveries by 2039. And we see this huge drop between just using SAF and introducing these more fuel efficient aircraft. So I think they're very important.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And we have a couple of questions related to how manufacturers have responded to this study. So, Supraja, do you have any sense of well, what feedback we've gotten from the OEMs, and in particular, if there's a recognition of the hard choices that are ahead for them?
I don't think I've seen any direct feedback from OEMs. I believe I saw, yeah, no, I don't think I've seen any direct feedback from OEMs, but I hope that it's, I think our findings are clear in that we see that these deliveries and the fleet growth that is projected are not sustainable under the net zero budget unless we make these rapid adjust a movement really towards both fuel efficiency improvements and zero emission planes and rapidly increase SAF use. So I'm hoping all of those points are clear, but I haven't seen anything directly from them. Have you?
Nope. I would say we have not gotten too much direct feedback on this study, but maybe this webinar will get us some.
Yeah.
All right. There is a question here about the cost of developing new zero emission planes. Do you have anything to say to that?
To be honest, I don't. I don't have much insight on how much it would cost. We're seeing kind of preliminary conceptual designs from Airbus right now through their Zero E initiative, but I haven't seen any numbers on what the investment would look like.
Okay. I will put in a plug for a different study. So in 2022, ICCT put out a net zero CO2 roadmap for aviation. As part of that work, we did calculate the carbon prices and fuel prices that would be necessary in order to hit net zero emissions from airlines in 2050. What we found in that work that carbon prices on the order of $300 per ton by 2040 would be necessary to support the net zero transition. And under the hood of that modeling, we concluded that SAFs were actually driving the majority of the costs. So the mitigation costs for e-fuels in particular are high enough such that if we do hit very high volumes of SAFs, that will drive sufficient fuel price increase to support the development of new aircraft types, so more fuel efficient aircraft powered by jet fuel, first and foremost, but also by our estimates, the development costs for hydrogen-based aircraft. There's another data point on this, which is ICAO's long-term aspirational goal calculations. And there again, they've concluded that the production, like the development cost for hydrogen aircraft will be significant, but relative to the overall price tag of net zero, which is by their estimate about $4 trillion for international flights only, it is actually a relatively small share. So across a number of studies, it actually looks like SAF production, and in particular e-fuel production, drives a lot of the costs. Um, I think we've answered most of the questions here. Um, I think, why don't we, well, I see a couple late ones here. Let's try and get those. Um, so yes, back to the question of SAFs versus hydrogen and electricity. So uh, James Beard is making the point here that there's a lot in here. So our study is covering the need to make planes more fuel efficient, also compatible with 100% SAFs, and also for OEMs to start developing hydrogen and potentially electric aircraft. So it's a lot of asks. So Supraja, if you were to sequence those, so in terms of what's most important, how would you do that? So fuel efficiency, 100% SAF compatibility, and then zero emission plane.
A good question. I think I would start with the 100% SAF compatibility because it's a relatively smaller ask than designing a whole new aircraft. So I would put that at the top. And then I would go to fuel efficiency because these are aircraft that are still similar in design to the ones that are existing today, and easier for OEMs to develop. So that would be the second one. And then third would be hydrogen aircraft, all within a very tight timeline, as we've discussed. So 2035 would be when we would ask for all of these to be in play. But yeah, that's my ordering.
Well, I'm glad that we're the analysts and not the manufacturers. But net zero is a very, very challenging goal. So, um,
Yes.
well, I think we can wrap there. A few other points in the chat. We will be making the slides available, and maybe Jessica, you can say a few words about how we'll do that. But yes, that's all from me. Thank you very much for your interest in the webinar, and I'll turn it back over to you, Jessica.
Thank you, Supraja and Dan, for the very informative session. I learned a lot from both of you. And I also want to thank everyone on the line for participating in today's webinar. Your insights and questions are highly valued. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any further questions, like Dan said earlier. And Supraja is sharing her email here, and she will be your point of contact person. And again, we will be sharing today's slides and recordings on our website, so be sure to look out for those. You can also find a schedule of our future webinars available online or via our newsletter, and we hope to see you all there. Lastly, remember to follow ICCT on our social media. We are active on LinkedIn and X. And I think that's it. I hope you have a great rest of your day and see you next time. Thank you, everybody. Bye
Thank
for
you.
now.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye.